It's Monday, the 5th of February 2024. Welcome to the Fast 5 Business News by Fear and Greed, where we give you the top 5 business stories you need to know in just 5 minutes. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael.
Sean, 5 stories, 5 minutes. Let's get going. Story number 1, half-year profit season on the ASX starts this week with some pretty decent expectations about corporate Australia's earnings, pushing the share market to another record on Friday.
Yeah, imagine that. Record earnings season about to start. What could go wrong? Expectations are pretty high, not just about earnings, but the outlook for 2024. That's because the economy looks to be avoiding a recession. Interest rates are set to start falling later in the year, and the global outlook is pretty good. That's pushed the ASX 200 above 7,700 points for the first time, albeit briefly, on Friday. It closed just under that level. Now, volumes have been a bit thin, therefore the market's a bit more volatile, but still, we'll find out over the next few weeks how things are going. The banks and miners might not do quite as well. Some pressure on profit margins there. Industrial's supposed to do very well. The retailers have already said they're having a hard time of it, and the healthcare stocks, they'll be watched very closely. They haven't performed as well as others. Of course, the technology stocks we all love, so we'll be watching those ones closely.
Yeah, and of course, Sean, as you've explained to us in the past, share prices work on what investors think is going to happen rather than really what has happened. So what's the outlook going to be?
Well, that's the $64 question. Investment analysts reckon the second half of this year and into 2025 will be a period of recovery. That's because interest rates are forecast to fall, and that should help economic growth. It means earnings will be steady, maybe 5% or so across the board, but there will be a few bombs. We've already seen a few. Remember Domino's Pizza a couple of weeks ago? Its share price fell 30% when it said some of its overseas stores weren't doing so well. Earnings season kicks off this week. Emcor, AGL, Boral, Transurban, REA, a bunch of property companies all report. Things get very busy next week and the week after.
Yeah, it's going to be a very, very busy time, very exciting time for a podcast like this one, Sean. On to story number 2. Car makers will be forced to sell more electric and fuel-efficient vehicles in the Australian market, or they're going to face financial penalties. This is under a new efficiency standard to begin on January 1 next year.
Climate Change and Energy Minister Chris Bowen says the new standard will bring Australia into line with all developed nations, and it will make manufacturers subject to an overall emissions cap that their vehicles could collectively produce, according to a story in the Financial Review. The cap will be lowered each year, effectively acting as a carbon price, in that it will force the increased manufacture of cleaner vehicles and the phasing out of more polluting petrol and diesel cars. Under the model to be pursued by the government, both passenger vehicles and SUVs, as well as utes and vans, including large pickups, will have to reduce their respective emissions by 60% between 2025 and the end of this decade.
On to story number 3, Sean. This is a fascinating one. The first proper weekend for home sales across the country. It was a cracker, wasn't it? CoreLogic says it is the second best starting weekend in 14 years of data. Was anyone expecting this?
No, I don't think so. The national preliminary clearance rate was a touch under 74% from 1,671 listings, which is pretty impressive, particularly given the number of listings was 25% higher than a year earlier, and the clearance rate was 12 percentage points better than the first weekend of February last year. It looks like falling inflation and the prospect of rate cuts later in the year has added a bit of momentum to the market. In terms of individual cities, Sydney came in at 76.3%. That's the highest since the middle of last year. Melbourne's a touch under 72%, Brisbane 68.5%, Adelaide at 77.6%. One weekend does not make a trend, Michael, but a very solid start to 2024.
It absolutely is. Story number 4, Australian wine exports, Sean. They fell last year, hit by rising living costs around the globe, but also hit by a trend towards sobriety.
Australia's wine exports fell by 2% last year, according to Wine Australia, and there was a shift towards cheaper bottles of Plonk. But it's the sobriety trend, which is good or bad, depending on your perspective. Research shows that younger people are drinking less and overall a drop in alcohol consumption in all regions, except Asia, according to a report in The Australian. In Europe, which holds some of Australia's largest and most important wine export markets, 15 regions saw a decline in the value of wine bought from Oz. In the US and Canada, wine exports fell 7% and 24% respectively. However, Asia provided a ray of hope. Hong Kong was up 74%. Singapore was up just a touch. Now, remember, Australian wine was still effectively locked out of the China market last year. Hopefully that will change this year.
Last one, story number 5. Americans streamed 20% more content last year compared to a year earlier, with the number of shows and movies to choose from, this is extraordinary, sitting at almost 1 million, Sean, from over 90 different streaming services.
Yeah. And the number one show was the decade-old Suits, with 57.7 billion minutes of viewing time, bettering previous record holder The Stranger Things. That was back in 2022. The third all-time is The Office back in 2020. According to Nielsen, Suits was ostensibly an original Netflix show for many viewers because they didn't watch it previously on USA Network. Bluey, one of your favourites, all about the Aussie cattle dog. It's the number one children's show with 43.9 billion minutes streamed last year. Another interesting fact is that the older network shows are getting more popular. Now, NCIS, Grey's Anatomy, they're always on these lists. Friends made a comeback last year, particularly after the untimely death of one of its stars, Matthew Perry. Finally, the number one streamed original show was on Apple TV. One of your favourites, Michael, Ted Lasso.
Oh, well-deserved. Great show. There we go, the top 5 business stories in 5 minutes. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It's Monday, the 5th of February, 2024. Remember, please, to hit follow on the podcast. And if 5 minutes isn't enough, you can find our longer daily show called Fear and Greed Business News wherever you listen to podcasts. That one comes with a bunch of interviews and things as well. Today's interview is a great one for investors. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was the Fast 5 Business News by Fear and Greed. Have a great day.